What I'm going to talk about is mainly about Australia, because it's a work I've done which is available on the website of the Social Inclusion Unit in the Prime Minister's Department in Australia. So it's relatively recent, but again, a lot of the comparisons, some of the comparisons of some outcomes refer to around 2005, but I've tried to actually take account of the Working for Families initiative. But there's quite a lot of similarities between Australia and New Zealand, although there are important differences. Given the time I've got, I'll skip over a lot of slides, some of which Willem's already had some information on. So what I'm going to talk about is family joblessness in Australia, the definition and some trends in family joblessness, some of the barriers to employment that appear to face lone parents, and do these barriers potentially explain differences in employment outcomes. Because as Willem pointed out, basically what you've got is very large differences in the proportion of lone parents in employment, and you also have in Australia, relatively speaking, a much higher proportion of couples with children where nobody's in employment than in most other OECD countries. So something like about 5% of couples with children in Australia are jobless, and that's a significant contributor to the overall household joblessness situation. Now, in this definition of joblessness, it's sort of what it says is that people don't have paid work. So they're not unemployed. So it includes the unemployed who are not in paid work but are actively looking for work. But it also includes those who are not participating in the labour force. Now, this is quite a controversial issue because basically the main reason why people aren't participating in the labour force is they're caring for children. Caring for children has to be done. You know, it's unavoidable. It's a very important social role. So there is a debate about whether this is a focus on paid work, not work in the broader sense. But the thing about it is that if you look at countries like Denmark, Sweden and Finland, they're countries which seem to have very low child poverty and pretty good outcomes for children in an international sense. They have high employment, you know, sort of. So it's actually the combination of generous welfare state and high employment that leads to low child poverty. Now, joblessness exists at the individual, the household or the family level, and also amongst communities, so you can measure it in different ways. And it can be looked at from the parental perspective or from the child's perspective. And duration and dynamics are very important as well in thinking about joblessness. In Australia, basically what's happened is that from the early 1970s onwards, the proportion of families who are lone parents started to increase quite significantly, partially associated with divorce law reform and also benefit reform, which extended assistance to a wider group of lone parents than in the past. Then, in the recession of the early 1980s, there was a really marked increase in unemployment amongst families with children. And that then took a long time to decline. It increased again in the early 1990s. So basically from the early 1970s, from the mid-1970s onwards, but with a big upswing in the early 1980s, you had a marked increase in family joblessness. But basically you have much higher levels of joblessness amongst lone parents. And also because of the increase in the number of lone parents, that increased the level of family joblessness. Now, for families with children, the level of joblessness peaked at about 19% in 1998, and then it started not quite a consistent fall. It varied from year to year, but it then fell up to 2008. So family joblessness fell from 19% in 1998 to 12% in 2008. But in the last year, between June 2008 and June 2009, while we technically escaped recession, the employment to population ratio for Australia fell by about 1.2 percentage points. But for lone parents, the fall was close to 5 percentage points, and for lone parents with a child under 4 years, the employment rate fell by 8 percentage points. And in fact, joblessness amongst couples with children increased at virtually the same rate as it did in the early 1980s recession. So the last year has been very worrying, although unemployment's trending down, but we don't get the figures for family unemployment as regularly as we do for general unemployment. So this shows, from its peak in 1998, trends in lone parent joblessness by age of child, with the bright red bar at the top being the proportion of families where the youngest child is under 5, then the blue bar where they're 5 to 9, the youngest child, and then where it's 10 to 14. So joblessness is related to the age of a child, and it was also pointed out to me yesterday, it's also related to the age of the parent. And one of the differences you have in New Zealand is that you seem to have younger, because you've got higher teenage birth rate than Australia, you have younger parents, so that's an additional barrier that you might have, issue that you might have here that we don't have to quite the same extent. Now, basically, although it's not quite the same, the group who were most affected by the policy changes that Willem referred to were people in the 5 to, it affected people whose youngest child was age 7. So you can actually see there was a slight increase in joblessness in the year between 2005 and 2006. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but then there's been a fairly significant decline, but an upswing in between 2008 and 2009. The other thing that's happened since the early 2000s is the proportion of families with children who are lone parents started to decline. That's happened in the past a couple of times, but it seems to have been a more consistent decline in the last decade than it has previously been in the past. So joblessness fell partly because of increasing employment, but also because of falling lone parenthood.